my colleague, my friend, Professor Mauro Nobili from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Nobili is originally from Italy, from Naples, a PhD from the, I can never say it since I don't speak Italian, but the Orientale University in Naples, which is a place where he studied philology, Arabic, Oriental studies. I don't know actually what the degree is in.
African and Islamic studies.
African and Islamic studies. So perfect. He has had, before arriving at in Champaign, Illinois, he spent time in Cape Town, South Africa, in Hamburg, in Germany, a number of other stops. And in addition to the book that he's going to talk about today, which is about a famous chronicle, supposedly from the 17th century, which recounts part of the story of the Songhai Empire and its Moroccan successor state. He's going to explain to us about how that story, that received story, is incorrect. And he's done this marvelous research figuring out how a kind of forgery, a kind of create a 19th century version of a text that pretended to be from the 17th century was put together, and for what purpose. And so we're going to, I think, learn more about that here today. But in addition to this work, he's also somebody who worked quite closely with Arabic manuscript materials from West Africa. He has produced catalogs and hand lists of some important collections of Arabic manuscripts from West Africa. He has an active relationship with many intellectuals and manuscript holders and owners in West Africa. So he's really at the center of a lot of what's going on when it comes to the Muslim intellectual tradition that we have access to today through the Arabic language manuscript materials that are really found throughout the region. And he's written this terrific book that he's going to be talking about today. And just very briefly, because I know everybody wants to hear from him, not from me, but this, it seems to me, opens up a whole new terrain to rethink about what we thought we knew about Muslim West Africa in the 19th century and in earlier periods. So I think that the hard, detailed work that's been done in this book results in a great book that's really, really great in its own terms, but it also opens up all sorts of space for others who will follow in the kind of area that's being opened up by this work. So it's, I think, important in the double sense of being an excellent work on its own terms, but also will be seen as something which is key to a new way of doing pre-colonial Muslim. So with those words, I turn that over to you, Mauro, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Neil, for literally bringing me here. And it's a pleasure to actually present for the first time my research in person, considering that the book came out during the pandemics. So my previous presentation were always in my office at home. So it's great to share it with real people and non-small screens on my computer. So today I'm going to talk about basically my recent book that is titled Sultan, Caliph and the Renewal of the Faith, Aḥmad Lobbo, the Tariq Al Fatash and the Making of an Islamic State in West Africa. This long title will be much more clear at the end of today's presentation, hopefully. So what I'm going to tell you is a story of a West African Arabic chronicle that is called the Tariq Al Fatash, which is actually not that easy to translate into English. I kind of settle on the book of the obstinate researcher. Fatash gives this idea of somebody who searches for something like crazy in a way, searching for something with a lot of attention, passion, etc. That has been translated also in French as La Chronique du Chercheur, as you will see in 1913. And I want to tell you a story of this chronicle in relationship to a particular West African state that emerges in 1818. We actually have a specific date in what is central Mali that you can see here on on the map between Jenne and Tombouctou, two very important centers of learning and trade. And it lasted for half a century. And it's a state that emerges after a revolution that is led by a scholar whose name was Aḥmad Lobbo. So the story that I will tell you is a story of the Chronicle and how this Chronicle provide legitimacy to this state that emerges after a military coup, we could say in contemporary terminology. So what I will do today, I'll be very schematic. I work in three parts. The first one, I will walk you through the history of the edition of the Tariq Al Fatash and how scholars have been dealing with several of the problems that emerged out of this edition. And I will suggest a way to solve these 100 years, I like to call it a conundrum around the Chronicle. Then in the second section, in a Foucaultian way, I will talk about the archaeology of this Chronicle. By archaeology, I mean, what were the conditions that made the creation of this Chronicle possible and necessary, which is basically its relationship with the legitimacy of the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi. And then I will tell you a little bit about how the Chronicle, so this, 150 pages manuscript book, actually worked on the ground, how the claims of the Chronicle were disseminated on the ground, etc. So let's start a little bit with the history of the Chronicle and the edition of the Chronicle by paying attention to two places that apparently have nothing in common. So one place is in France, in the middle of France here, in Sancergue, and another place that is also as remote as Sancergue in contemporary Niger, Zinder. So let's start from Niger and Zinder. In the summer of 1912, this character that you can see here at the center of the picture, these Muslim scholars here in white, whose name was Yusuf ibn al-Khalil. We know him as a famous local scholar, relatively famous local scholar who owned a quite sizable collection of manuscripts, was visited by an unlikely visitors. That is this guy dressed in a typical colonial attire, whose name was Georges de Gironcourt. De Gironcourt was a French agronomist with a strange passion for everything that he could find in Arabic, be it inscriptions on stone, epigraphs, but also actually Arabic manuscripts. So Gironcourt managed to establish a relationship with our scholar from Zinder, Yusuf bin al-Khalil, and his students, as you can see in this other picture here, copied several of the manuscripts from the collection of Yusuf ibn al-Khalil for de Gironcourt. And Gironcourt brought them back to Paris, where they are now stored at Institut de France, a beautiful location in Paris by the river. There's a large collection of more than 140 manuscripts, but there was one particular manuscript that attracted my attention. That is a very short one. It's only 4 leaves, which means 8 pages. And it's titled Tariq Al Fatash, exactly as the Chronicle that we're going to talk about today. But despite this obvious association of this manuscript with the Tariq Al Fatash, this Chronicle, this particular manuscript of the Chronicle, had never really attracted the attention of scholars. So everybody had been aware of this Chronicle, this manuscript of the Chronicle, sitting in Paris since 1912, but nobody really worked on it. So let's now take this manuscript, let's put it aside, and let's see what was happening exactly at the same time in Sancergue, in France, when these two characters, very famous Orientalists, French Orientalists of the time, the older guy, Octave Audace, was working with his son-in-law, the other guy with mustache, Maurice de la Fosse, a famous ethnographer and historian in his own way of West Africa of the colonial period. So they were together on vacation, and I mean, many of us know very well that oftentimes on vacation it means working on something. So they were on vacation working on some manuscripts that they had identified, according to them, as copies of the Tariq Al Fatash, and they were editing and translating them into French, providing with an extensive set of footnotes. A year after this summer of intense work, Audace and de la Fosse published eventually what they believe to be the reliable edition and translation of the Tariq Al Fatash, and this is the cover page of the original edition of the Chronicle in 1913. So this Chronicle became immediately very, very important as one of the major sources of African history, pre-colonial African history, along with another chronicle is called the Tariq al-Sudan. So these became the two major chronicles for pre-colonial, especially for the Middle Niger, but their scope is actually quite wider. So it talks about ancient empire of Ghana, Mali, and of course Songhai, and after the empire of the Songhai, this invasion of Moroccans and a new state that emerges out of that. It became so important and so used by scholars after that, that for instance, it has been reprinted as part of the UNESCO collection of representative literary works in the African series. Not only was so famous the text itself in this particular format, but it has been, in the past 10 years roughly, also used to produce a rather poor English translation, as well as 3 more Arabic rendering of the same text. So they did not do research on new manuscript. They just retook the original Arabic manuscript as produced by Audace and de la Fosse, providing it with new footnotes, trying to update a little bit the critical apparatus of the text itself. So there was a theory that emerged already at the time of Audace and de la Fosse, the original editors and translators of the Chronicle, that has gone almost unchallenged, or rather unchallenged, throughout basically 100 years since its publication in 1913, is that the Tariq Al Fatash was a work that had been begun by one Muslim scholar from the area of Timbuktu called Mahmoud Qadi, who wrote it sometimes between the late 1400s and completed in the 1500s. And this scholar had a particularly long life because he died at age under 25 in 1593. You can already see that something sketchy going on here. But then the Chronicle continues because there are some of the songs of this Mahmoud Qadi that added new pieces to the Chronicle, until in the 17th century, one maternal grandson of Mahmoud Qadi wrote another version of the Chronicle itself that is considered to be kind of the final version of the Chronicle, until in the 19th century, there was some slight modification in the original text. So you can see that this is a Chronicle with a history of its own that is already complex, even in the very first analysis of the history of the Chronicle by the editors of the Chronicle itself. You can imagine there is already a lot of gaps, multi-layered authorship, people living for more than 100 years. So it's not surprising that immediately after its publication, several scholars have started reviewing this text and providing critiques of the text and suggesting possible solutions to make sense of this quite intricate history of the Tariq Al Fatash. I'm just putting here some examples of scholars who have contributed to the critical scholarship on the Tariq Al Fatash. I mentioned one that was published in 1914, so basically immediately after the publication of the Chronicle. Then John Anwick, that is one of the most famous scholars of West African manuscripts. Likewise, Nehemiah Letzion, Madina Lital, who is one of the most important Malian historian of Africa, pre-colonial African history. And most of these scholars have debated issues of authorship, so who was in fact the author of the Chronicle, but also the extent of this manipulation, because one thing that is obvious is that there's been more than one layer of writing behind the Chronicle. There's one sentence that I always like to quote from Madina Lital that I really think that it summarizes the feeling, the kind of the gut feeling of everybody who reads the Chronicle. She said, I mean, I'm translating this from the French, who does not prove a sentiment of discomfort reading the text, notwithstanding the precise footnotes that should clarify it? Definitely, I felt substantial discomfort in reading the edition and the Arabic edition, the translation of the Tariq Al Fatash. There has been, however, I would say, a strange approach of scholars who were trying to work on the Chronicle. So nobody really worked on the actual manuscripts, and an assumption that in fact was, I will prove that was completely unsupported, dominated, meaning that there were no surviving copies of the Tariq Al Fatash after the edition, as if the edition made all of the copies of this chronicle disappear. So starting from my late PhD years, I embarked in a series of trips looking for copies of the Tariq Al Fatash. So I wanted to find copies that could tell us a better story of these chronicles, of which I was the last of a long line of people who was unsatisfied with. So this took me in several interesting trips. Everything started actually in France, where I found, if you remember, the manuscripts from Sinder, that location in Niger that I presented you at the beginning of my presentation. Then, of course, took me to Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and indirectly also to Ghana and Mauritania, to Burkina Faso and Mauritania. I didn't visit these two countries personally, but I had somebody who basically helped me in locating copies of this chronicle. And in fact, I found almost a dozen copies that local catalogs, hand lists, or simply local scholars had identified as copies of the Tariq Al Fatash, or as some documents that in a way mentioned, quoted the Tariq Al Fatash, or seemed interesting to tell the story of the Tariq Al Fatash, that in fact would prove crucial for me to reconstruct the history of the chronicle. So let's now try to sort out these copies of manuscripts. You can clearly see that there were three main families of manuscripts here. My philological training that Bruce mentioned at the beginning of my presentation comes very strong. So family number one includes one of the three copies that were used by Udassin de la Fosse for their edition. This is hosted by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. This is one of the copies. I didn't do that a big discovery for that. There is simply like a donation of this manuscript that you can see here in French that opens the manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale. While on the contrary, two more important discoveries took place in Tombouctou, where I found a copy of the first and most important manuscript used by the editors in 1913 that, according to scholars, had gone lost after the edition. It is this one. It was not lost at all. It simply went back to Timbuktu, where it came before being used for the edition. But in the same archive, that is the Ahmed Baba Institute, just shorthand for complicated name, which is the major repository of Arabic manuscripts in Timbuktu. And also a second fragmentary copy of the same chronicle in the same institution. Then a second family that preserves a different version of the text. So these are different versions of the text. In fact, is composed of a single manuscript that I do not have. It is the third copy employed by the two editors in 1913, but that we can reconstruct what I call its virtual text, because these two scholars, although, as I will prove, they were very wrong in understanding the chronicle, they were quite thorough in their philological skills. So thanks to their specific footnotes and very precise footnotes, I can reconstruct at least a tentative version of the text that's preserved by this manuscript. Then eventually, the majority of these manuscripts belong to a third family that is neither the first one nor the second one, substantially different. It has several manuscripts, some from this Ahmed Baba Institute, some you can see obviously relatively new, you can see it from the paper and from the inks, some a little bit older, some very new again. These are all from the same institution. This is even written with a ball pen, so with a big pen. Some beautifully decorated from a small town in the area of Banikan, south of Timbuktu. Some from Niger, even in this case, written with a ball pen, actually on Russian paper. I don't really know. There is some Russian newspaper, if you look at the other side of, especially of the cover pages. So why are these manuscripts interesting? because by comparing this manuscript with the edited text, what emerged very clear that all of these latter manuscripts are in fact copies of the edited text. So after this text was published in Paris, it went back to West Africa, and people started copying it in time back into manuscript format. And I really like this one, for example, because this is the typical triangular shape that completes many West African manuscripts. But our copies here decided to copy on the sides of the triangle the appendices of the edition. So you can see this material aspect of the Chronicle that's very fascinating. So in summing up on these families, family tree is completely useless for somebody who's interested in the pre-edition history of this Chronicle, because they are copies of the Chronicle. Let's get rid of it. Family 2, the only manuscript that I reconstructed virtually thanks to the philological attention of the original editors, it is apparently a 16th century chronicle written by that guy that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Mahmud Kati, but it's clearly a forgery. There is several references to the 19th century, including a prophecy that foretells the arrival of Aḥmad Lobbo, the founder of the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi, that I introduced at the beginning of my talk and that figures in the title of my book. And then there is the family of the first three manuscripts that is a coherent 17th century chronicle that has been obviously used as a starting point to produce the text of family 2, what is the real Tariq Al Fatash, the only text that preserves the name Tariq Al Fatash. So we can already start by saying that Tariq Al Fatash is the name of the text of family 2, meaning is the name of the 19th century chronicle, allegedly, so apocryphally ascribed to the 16th century to Mahmud Kati. Is this clear right now? So we have 19th century chronicle that pretends to be older and a 17th century chronicle. What happened is that in the 1913, the two editors misunderstood this complex relationship. So they thought that all of the manuscripts belonged to the same text. So they started producing a critical edition, basically, of two different texts, conflating them into one. So the 19th edition that everybody has used is basically a pastiche. It is a term that is used to refer to something that is a mix of different things, because it conflates together a 17th century chronicle, family 1, and a 19th century apocryphal work, family 2, that pretends to be from the 16th, 15th, and 16th century. So this is a complex philological work behind the more historical part of my research. So let's move to the chronicle itself. So once I've convinced you that this is a 19th century chronicle, we can use it as a source for the 19th century. So we move more towards history from philology. And I don't think of a better way to start talking about history than citing Mark Bloch. There is this part of Mark Bloch, the historian's craft, that always attracted my attention. So I'll just read it extensively, although it's a little bit longer. So to establish the fact of a forgery is not enough. We have a forgery, a 19th century text that pretends to be from the 16th century. It is further necessary to discover its motivations. Above all, a fraud is, in its way, a piece of evidence. Merely to prove that the famous charter of Charlemagne to the Church of Aix-la-Chapelle is not authentic is to avoid an error, but not to acquire knowledge. On the other hand, should we succeed in proving that the forgery was committed by the followers of Frederick Barbarossa and that it was designed to implement dreams of imperial grandeur, we open new vistas upon the vast perspective of history. So my questions behind my research was, why a yet unnamed supporter of Aḥmad Lobbo and of the Caliphate that he founded manipulated older text? Why Aḥmad Lobbo needed somebody to create this complicated forgery? And which kind of state was the one that Aḥmad Lobbo was ruling over if he needed some kind of forgery to boast its legitimacy? So these were kind of the guiding questions behind my research. So let's take a little bit a look at what was the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi. So first of all, as I mentioned, it is a state that emerges after an Islamic revolution. By Islamic revolution here, I mean a revolution that was led by a Muslim scholar that in 1818 established in this part of Mali a new state fighting against the temporal, I could say, ruler of the region that were the Bambara. Bambara is a ethnic group in West Africa that were centered here in Ségou, a little bit upstream, yeah, from Ḥamdallāhi. It's going to be founded somewhere here, as well as the local Fulani, another ethnic group of the region, who were ruling as kind of proxy rulers of the Bambara kings of Ségou. So they were ruling the region that eventually will become the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi. As well as the religious establishment, so the scholars, the most prominent class of scholars, that was centered in this city, Jenne, here, that will be eventually part of the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi. So, as I mentioned, I think at the beginning of my presentation, the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi is just one of a series of revolutions that characterizes West Africa in the 18th and in the 19th century. It's a revolution that, in the words of close friend and colleague Amir Said, are important because, and I'm quoting him, they reimagine the place of Muslim clerics in relationship to political power. So the normative position of Muslim scholars in the fabric, in the social and political fabric of West Africa prior to the 17th century was that of distance from the representative of political power. What famous Gambian historian Lamin Sanneh refers to the political neutrality of Muslim scholars that is oftentimes embodied in this group of Muslim specialists widespread throughout West Africa, the Jahanke. With Islamic revolutions and people like Aḥmad Lobbo, but we have no pictures of Aḥmad Lobbo, so I decided to use the case of another Muslim revolutionary who in fact destroyed Ḥamdallāhi in 1862. We don't really know if the picture is actually this guy, El-Haji Omar Tal. This is the only picture that and it was closer in time to Aḥmad Lobbo. So people like Aḥmad Lobbo, El-Haji Omar Tal, but also previous rulers in Sokoto, about which we will speak a little bit about later on, transformed completely the political landscape, establishing states like Ḥamdallāhi, in which the legitimacy of the political legitimacy rested on the religious authority of the rulers. So Aḥmad Lobbo was a scholar whose political legitimacy rested in the, to make this complicated story simple, of him being recognized as a scholar of Islamic sciences. Okay? As you can imagine, this is a new reimagination of political power, a reimagination of the role of Muslim scholars. And all of these new things, of course, don't go uncontested. So the Middle Niger, the region where Ḥamdallāhi emerges, became, with the emergence of the movement led by Aḥmad Lobbo, what I call a contested space of competing claims. So the claims of Aḥmad Lobbo were resisted, first of all, by military elites, all the rulers of the time, the Bambara from the south in Ségou and the Fulani from the region itself, but also by previously established Muslim scholarly elites, like for example, the famous Kunta family that is centered around the area of Timbuktu, as well as one of the neighboring post-Islamic revolution states, the Sokoto Caliphate from northern Nigeria. So what I will do now, I'll take a look at how the contestation of these three groups were dealt with by Aḥmad Lobbo and his supporters. And finally, the Fatash is coming in again. The old military elites were simply defeated in war. Not much, elaboration on chronicles on Islamic law were actually required. They were defeated in the battle. There's in fact a very beautiful oral epic of Bubu Ardogalo, who is the last of the Fulani rulers of the region was killed by the soldiers of Aḥmad Lobbo according to oral traditions that were translated into French by Christian Seydoux, who was a very famous specialist of Fulani epics. They're very beautiful epics, kind of like, I don't know if you've taken other African history classes where you studied the epic of Sunjata Keita or something like this. So this is that kind of literature. I'm not going to read it, but I really like the death of this poor Bulbuardo Gallo who was beheaded. And symbolically, in a way, it signals the end of an era, the era of the Fulani military aristocracies that will succumb under the attacks of Aḥmad Lobbo. But this does not really entail any kind of claims to Islamic legitimacy, etc. This was basically a military contest. Okay? More complicated was, on the contrary, how Ḥamdallāhi responded to the critiques that came from other established Muslim clerical lineages who, in a way, tapped in Islam as a similar source of legitimacy, although in different forms than the one that Aḥmad Lobbo was claiming. So, for example, the Kunta from Timbuktu. The Kunta from Timbuktu, contrary to what most of the, especially of the colonial historiography, argue, were not opposing Ḥamdallāhi at all. They actually welcomed the emergence of the Caliphate, especially because these families were also heavily involved in trade, and the emergence of a centralized state has always been welcomed as a way to foster trade. The problem here is that they did not recognize his role as ultimate religious authority that the Kunta were claiming for themselves. So they were ready to accept him as a ruler, but they were not ready to accept him as the ultimate scholar of the region, the ultimate scholarly authority of the region. And for example, I mean, I spent sometimes in the book, dealing with issue of tobacco. Aḥmad Lobbo is strongly against the consumption of tobacco. That was one of the commodities that the Kunta were actually extensively trading. For Aḥmad Lobbo, the consumption of tobacco was basically against his interpretation of Islamic law. So this manuscript that you can see here in the background is actually very interesting because it is a response to the request of Aḥmad Lobbo to some of the Kunta to collaborate in governing Timbuktu. And the response is based on a very classical but strict distinction between the role of scholars as ultimate repository of religious authorities versus the rulers in charge of political power. And I really like these citations, in which one of these Kunta, Muhammad al-Kunti, says, we are obliged to collaborate, but everyone in his domain for the smooth running of the Sharia or of the state, we could rephrase it. So you can see here, there is no specific resistance to the Caliphate as a new political institution, but there is a resistance against this new idea in which politics and religion are conflated in the same person, which is Aḥmad Lobbo. The situation is more complicated with the rulers of the neighboring state of Sokoto, because they were basically rejecting both the claims of political authority as well as religious authority of Aḥmad Lobbo, based on the fact that at the beginning of his movement, Aḥmad Lobbo had requested support that in fact never arrived from Sokoto when he had started his war against the local military elites. But the people of Sokoto maintain basically that because of this request and the offering of an allegiance from Aḥmad Lobbo, in fact, the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi was a dependent state from Sokoto. So they will never basically accept independence of Ḥamdallāhi with Sokoto. So as I say, the first type of contestation was literally dealt with weapons on the ground and destroyed quite fast. It was more complicated to deal with the complaints of this kind of elites who were again tapping into the repertoire of Islamic ideas about ruling, about rulership, about the role of the king, etc., etc. Here is where the Tariq Al Fatash comes back in, because the backbone of the Chronicle itself is claims to ultimate legitimacy of Aḥmad Lobbo as the ruler of West Africa, or Islamic West Africa, that are formulated in several parts of the Chronicle, but basically in a specific narrative in which a late medieval West African ruler of an empire is called the Songhai Empire. While he's in Mecca, he receives a prophecy that another ruler will come, will inherit his role as Caliph of West Africa. And in fact, claiming that this person who will come after Askia Muhammad will be much greater than him. Who is this person? It's of course our Aḥmad Lobbo. So there is a prediction of the arrival of Aḥmad Lobbo that would apparently, I mean, allegedly happen at the end of the 1400s. And I will now analyze how the Chronicle, through this prophecy, constructs the legitimacy of Aḥmad Lobbo in three levels. I like to call it a multi-layered form of legitimacy. As Sultan, as Caliph, and Renewer of the Faith, hence the title of my book. So let's briefly take a look at what these three titles mean in terms of legitimacy. So by Sultan, and by Sultan it simply means a temporal ruler in a Muslim space. So it's a ruler that doesn't necessarily claim any kind of religious legitimacy. So claiming the role as Sultan, the Chronicle, in fact, is exploiting a construction of a fictional line of legitimate West African rulers that is invented in the 17th century by chronicles like the one on which the Tariq Al Fatash is based. You remember the three family, where the family one with Old Chronicle. So that Old Chronicle has this idea that West Africa has always been dominated by legitimate Muslim rulers, for reasons that I'm not here to explain because they deal with the history of the 17th century in West Africa. But through the prophecy, the author, that is still anonymous, not for long, manages to reattach, despite the kind of, like a gap, a hiatus of 300 years. He inscribes Aḥmad Lobbo in this long list of legitimate rulers that was invented already in the 17th century. So it is inscribed in this long line of legitimate ruler of West Africa through the prophecy. That's not enough. There is a different layer that is added that really, really goes deep into the Islamic repertoire of power, of eschatology, which means, all those literature about the end of the world. So as a caliph and as a renewer of the faith. These are based on hadith. Are we familiar with what is a hadith? So it's the recording of deeds and sayings of Prophet Muhammad that are foundational for several branches of Islamic sciences, be it jurisprudence, Sufism, theology, etc., etc. So one of these hadith goes more or less like this. There is many different renderings of the same story. See, the religion will continue to be established until there are 12 caliphs over you, and the whole community will agree on each of them. So there will be 12 rulers that will go uncontested as the rulers of the entire Muslim community. And of course, Aḥmad Lobbo becomes one of them, and not just one of them, the last of them. And after this, in the several versions of this tradition of the Prophet, they continue by saying the end of the world is coming. So as I always, I made the same joke this morning, if you know that the end of the world is coming, you better side with the right people. So that's the meaning of caliph that is added to the forms of legitimacy of Aḥmad Lobbo. But it goes even further by using this concept of the renewer of the faith that is extremely popular throughout the Islamic world, but for some obscure reasons, very strong in West Africa. It's also based on another of the traditions of the Prophet that says, God will raise for his community at the end of every 100 years, someone who will renovate its religion for it. So the entire perception of time, I would say of mainstream Islamic thought, is of decline. At the time of the Prophet, the Muslim community reaches its peak, and then there is a tendency to decline. So God, in order to avoid this decline, sends every century somebody who basically brings back the religion up. And this was a claim that in West Africa was very popular, and that many people, including some of the Kunta, you remember, from Timbuktu, and some of the Sokoto rulers also would claim for themselves. So the Tariq Al Fatash appropriates these claims and gives it to Aḥmad Lobbo, adding a further level of legitimacy to the ruler himself. Now, finally, we can get back to the manuscript from Sinder, the one that I opened my presentation with. So what was this 4 pages manuscript? I think it's important now to go back. It is a chronicle in which verbatim, so word by word, all of the important stuff of the Tariq Al Fatash is concentrated, a sort of an abstract of the lengthier chronicle. But there is a but, very important thing. The name of the author of this chronicle is different from the one that we always read, Mahmud Kati. You remember the alleged 1400s, 1500 scholar. The name of this guy, as it's given, is Nuh, which is Noah, bin, which is son of al-Ṭāhir, son of Musa, meaning son of Moses. Not only we know that the name of the author of this abstracted version of the chronicle is this, but also it's quite clear that the title itself of the chronicle is ascribed to this guy. You know, in Arabic, it goes, here we go. Hada Tariq, Nuh ibn Ṭāhir, etc., etc., etc. وسميته Tariq Al Fatash, and I called it, and he called it Tariq Al Fatash, and the title is in fact a little bit longer. So finally, we have now a new author, starts making way more sense, because who is this Nuh ibn Ṭāhir? Nuh ibn Ṭāhir, we know from the scholarship on the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi to be literally one of the most famous scholars of Ḥamdallāhi, the right hand of Aḥmad Lobbo, the person to which actually Aḥmad Lobbo for a while had thought of giving power to when he was feeling that basically he was going to die. The one to which his son who had been invested as the successor, and a moment of, feeling unable to kind of fit in the shoes of his dad, he was ready to give the power to Nuh ibn Ṭāhir. And it's also the person who is buried in the mausoleum in now the ruins of Ḥamdallāhi, next to Aḥmad Lobbo and his son. If you can read French, say, here rest Aḥmad Lobbo, Sekou Amadou Sekou, that is the son, and Nuh ibn Ṭāhir. This was a prominent scholar from the time, very close to the political power. This is just, by the way, is a picture from the 1960s that showed the same mausoleum before this reconstruction. It seemed a very new mausoleum. In fact, that is how the mausoleum used to look like in the past. So what was this manuscript, this 4 pages manuscripts? And now I'm completely in the realm of speculation. There is a nice little reference, especially let's keep in mind that this was found in Niger, while Ḥamdallāhi is in Mali. So how did this thing arrive there? So there is a note that was written by our colonial agronomist and traveler, Gironcourt. You remember it with the colonial hat, dressed in white on pirogue or on the canoe in that picture at the beginning of my presentation. I translated his note at the beginning of the manuscript. He says, writing occupying the last 2 pages of a book, Khamus, in Arabic, Khamus is a dictionary. It gives you the centimeters, so the dimensions, and that look like about 50 years old. So if this is in 1913, most likely was from the 1860s, which is the time in which a lot of people related to Ḥamdallāhi actually left because of an invasion of people coming from the Senegal River Valley that destroyed Ḥamdallāhi. It was received, it continues, from a scholar, Marabu is a local name for scholar, from the Masina. So somebody who left Ḥamdallāhi, Masina is the geographical space of Ḥamdallāhi, left Masina and brought this dictionary, which had in the end of the actual dictionary these notes. We see it as an individual nice manuscript, actually quite beautiful calligraphy, while in fact these were notes sketched in the end, most likely in the empty pages of a dictionary. So I just wonder, again, pure speculation, is it possible that this was a book on which maybe somebody, maybe no, he transformed it into the lengthier chronicle? And this has no evidence. This is just a suggestion to try to fill in the gaps of history. So what happens now to transform this small draft into the lengthier chronicle? So there is an ingenious system in which these obviously forged events, the prophecy, became part author, Noah ibn Ṭāhir, the credibility of the chronicle itself, being him the right hand of Aḥmad Lobbo, would be very limited. I mean, in a way, like if I'm saying that my friend is the best scholar ever, maybe I'm not the most qualified person to make this claim. But notwithstanding anachronisms, the real author of the chronicle, this Nuh, ascribes the chronicle to a scholar from late 1400s, early 1500s, that we know had some kind of interest in history. And he made it the author of this chronicle and also the eyewitness of all these forged events. So in a way, in this way, the forgery creates a reliable witness of this story concerning the prophecy. So wrapping up on the chronicle itself, we can safely say that the Tariq Al Fatash was written in the 19th century by this guy called Noah ibn Ṭāhir in support of the ruler Aḥmad Lobbo, who founded the state of Ḥamdallāhi. But eventually he ascribed the chronicle to kind of cover his tracks to a reliable earlier source, Mahmud Kati, the alleged author according to the previous interpretation of the chronicle. But he did not write, just for me to be clear, everything from scratch. He used the previously existing chronicles, manipulating it, taking off stuff, putting in things, expanding it, reducing it, at the end of the day, creating a new chronicle that is what we call the Tariq Al Fatash. And then eventually we have the big problem, because in 1913, the two French editors and translators found some manuscripts of the 17th century Chronicle, some manuscripts of the 19th century Chronicle, and misunderstandings that complex relationship, they produced a mess, the 1913 edition. Now just quickly on the last part of this Chronicle. So this was like 100 and something manuscript pages. So how does a narrative work impact on the ground? How did these claims to legitimacy work on the ground? So we know very well that the chronicle itself did not circulate that much. We don't have many copies of the Tariq Al Fatash. What we have is citations of the chronicle in different documents. So it seems like the chronicle was mined by the apparatus of the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi to produce smaller documents that cites the chronicle itself. So it becomes a source to cite things in other types of documents. The most famous of all is surely this one, that is the so-called the letter on the appearance of the 12th Caliph. We know that the 12th Caliph is Aḥmad Lobbo. It's a fantastic little document, very widespread in West Africa. It starts, with the usual Muslim salutations at the beginning, and then they say, this letter is to announce to all of these people that Aḥmad Lobbo is the rightful West African ruler and the 12th Caliph. And then there is a sentence that I really always like a lot. So if some of you can read Arabic, you'll see that here we have فَإِنْ قِيلَ وَأَيْنَ الْمِصْدَاقُ. So if you ask me, what is the source for these claims about legitimacy? قُلْتُ, I will tell you, فِي نَاسِ Tariq Al Fatash, the text of the Tariq Al Fatash. And then he goes on with like 5, 6, 7 pages of citation from the Chronicle. And we know also very well this text circulated very well, and we have very detailed descriptions of how these manuscripts were read in public. They were like public crier who basically stand and read to people in towns, villages, cities, the content of the letter itself. And just for us to understand why these things circulated, we also have responses to this letter. So we can assume that the letter even arrived to what is today northern Nigeria, because we have a response to this letter that comes from a scholar from northern Nigeria, from Sokoto, who is basically a terrible confutation of the argument of the Tariq Al Fatash. The arguments of the Tariq Al Fatash are actually destroyed by this response from this scholar from northern Nigeria in a very interesting way, because contemporary scholars always focus on the obvious issue of anachronism. Who can believe that in the 15th century somebody can predict the arrival of a 19th century? The people who do believe in these things, and 19th century West Africa people did believe in these things. So the whole confutation is based on wrong citations. So, you know, we are all as scholars, students. So what is the major complaint in here is that you saying that so-and-so scholar has said this, but I went to look into his writings on this particular topic, he says something else. So you're either wrong or you're lying. So I really like this kind of argument, and gives you the kind of the way in which these scholars were understanding the craft. I really love this response. There's one aspect of the use of the Chronicle that I did not really explore, and I'm exploring right now for my new research, is that also the Chronicle was used to justify the imposition of almost of a slave status on certain groups of the Middle Niger, so within the area of Ḥamdallāhi. So basically, these people were considered enslavable, if not slave kind of by nature. And there is other documents like this other one, another fantastic little document that justifies the enslavement and the selling of specific people, not on the basis on any kind of legal precedent within the long tradition of Islamic jurisprudence on the subject, but on what? On the Chronicle. So you can see here in this passage in which it says it is legal to enslave these people on the basis of what is written in the Chronicle, in the Tariq Al Fatash. And most of these people were in fact some local river folk who were fishermen or hunters of animals on the river Niger. And this is something that is not confined to the books. It was happening on the ground. We have evidences, for example, from the 1850s that some people were migrating away from the territories controlled by Ḥamdallāhi. Why? These German explorers tell us, because they have been reduced to slavery by the rulers of Ḥamdallāhi. Now we are 3 generations after Aḥmad Lobbo, so it was still enforced. And these are also stories that have been maintained in oral traditions, like, for example, in this famous book from the 1950s by one of the so-called traditionalists of Mali, Amadou Hampâté-Bâ, who said in relationship to this specific topic, it is in fact Muslim jurists from the past who have written down the list of these Sudanese groups that can be basically bound to servitude. The Tariq Al Fatash lists them. So you can see that also these texts penetrated, of course, the oral traditions of the region. So going to the end, we understand very well that the Tariq Al Fatash is strongly tied to a political project, the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi. 1862, the Caliphate of Ḥamdallāhi is destroyed. The capital is taken by another ruler, the one who saw a picture actually at the beginning of my presentation. The elites dispersed. A chronicle like this makes no sense anymore, doesn't really work that much. So it will only be with French colonialism and the project of so-called scientific imperialism, to cite, Edmund Burke III, one of the many Burke historians. So what happens is that at the time when French in the early 1890s arrived in the region of Ḥamdallāhi, the Chronicle was not that popular anymore. Its function had finished in the 1860s. at the point that this guy, Félix Dubois, was a journalist who enters in Timbuktu immediately after the French took over the city and writes this very popular piece first, Le Figaro at Timbuktu, to document this newly conquered city with all of the prestige that a city like Timbuktu gave to French colonialism, I mean conquest at the time. But he cannot find the Chronicle. He hears about the Chronicle, he calls it the Phantom Book of the Sudan. It was not a popular text anymore. But then the French wanted to know about this text. They started looking for this text. This is another interesting manuscript in which a colonial officer requests to the local Muslim jurist of Timbuktu to look for some historical documents. And the one that is cited here, for those of you who can read Arabic, is the Tariq Al Fatash. So the Tariq Al Fatash becomes one of the sources that the French want to achieve. Basically, we go back to square one. Udassin de la Fosse obtained the copies of the Chronicles. They produced their big mess, the 1913 edition, and we're back to square one. And right now, as a kind of complement and continuation and conclusion, I would say, of my book, the one I presented today, I'm finalizing with my colleague from Hill Museum and the Manuscript Library, Ali Jakite, and my colleague from Northwestern in Qatar, Zachary Wright, a new parallel edition and translation of the 17th century Chronicle, the original one, and on the other side, the Tariq Al Fatash from the 19th century, both in the Arabic text and 19th century and 17th century. Thank you very much.
So we can take anybody's questions or comments. So the floor, I think, is open.
Very much for a very interesting story that conveys my ignorance of this Islamic Arabic world. Apart from the insertion of the text that is supposed to be legitimating a logo, what are the key contents of the 17th century authentic version? What was it like?
So this is a chronicle of mainly the Middle Niger, from a mythical time in which an alleged foreign ancestor, very typical, of the history of all of those West African polities that come out of mobility. So there is an alleged arrival of somebody coming from Yemen who arrives in the Middle Niger and starts the first dynasty of the region, and then eventually the Empire of Mali extends its power on the region of the Middle Niger, and then there is a new dynasty of local people who takes the power, two different ruling families, and then eventually in 1591 there is a Moroccan invasion. There's a description of the Moroccan invasion and of the state that resulted from this Moroccan invasion. But in fact, this chronicle is apparently a simple political history of the region. It's in fact a very complicated one, because already in the 17th century, the ideological stakes that this chronicle is trying to, that the original chronicle is trying to support, are in fact making sense of a new political order post-Moroccan invasion, in which the Muslim scholars who had occupied a very important position at the time of the so-called Songhai Empire, so they claim space into this new state in a way that mirrors this previous dynasty at the time of the Askia. So it is not that simple as a political history of the region, as many scholars until today are actually using it. Is a complex ideological project that was written in the 17th century to make sense of political upheavals of the time. So some of these elements are retained in the 19th century chronicle when they made sense. But one of the work of the 19th century forger was also to amend, to cleanse the older chronicle of those things that were not really that suited to the 19th century political context. So in fact, it would be a misrepresentation of the Chronicle to say that there is an original that is kind of, I would say, a simple political history of the region and then a complex political project in the 19th century. We have two very complicated political projects that we need as complex works of creative history and kind of, I would rather say, almost a philosophy of history that is used to justify specific political projects, both of them. Substantially different political projects, but they share part of the content of this text. Does it make sense? Yeah.
Would you describe a little bit about your experience working in archives in Africa and kind of what that entailed for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm laughing and looking at Bruce because it's a very unorthodox way, I would say, of doing research, especially in Malian archives, but not only, because my experience has always been one that privileges first of all, personal connections, establishing personal relationship with people working at archives. Archives that tends to be rather inaccessible at times. So personal connection are basically crucial. A lot of time in gaining confidence of people on the ground. And then eventually when you break this kind of wall that separates the researcher from the actual people working in the library, for me it has become extremely easy. I mean, right now, I send a WhatsApp message to receive like a manuscript. So I always say that when I go for field work, I'm in fact doing networking. Maybe your experience was different also because of time. You know, Mali after 2012 gone through a civil war, fall of the state, insecurity. So your time was there, I think, and your experience was different from mine. But for me, it's basically meeting people in the capital, chatting, then eventually receiving stuff on WhatsApp. This is, of course, not all the time the case. My experience, for instance, in Senegal has been way more structured. Experience in Nigeria, likewise. Nowadays, also, there have been several projects of digitization of manuscripts. So, for example, I have accessed some of the manuscripts from the National Archive in Kaduna in Nigeria, that when I eventually visited the National Archive in Nigeria, I realized that it would have taken me like maybe 2 years to actually find a document that I could download very easily from this project. This is called the Endangered Archives Project. This is a project of digitization of large types of, very many different types of documents, from pictures. So even for students, I think it's very important as a resource. Other experiences, well, a very interesting part of the work was conducted in Ivory Coast in Ghana, when I encountered, in fact, a forgery behind a forgery. I wrote this article because there was a catalog, the catalog of Ghana, Burkina Faso, and also Ivory Coast. As I say, I didn't go to Burkina Faso, I only did Ivory Coast and Ghana myself personally, in which we discovered that the actual catalogs published were forgeries themselves. So this manuscript did not exist on the ground. So looking for a forged manuscript, it led us to realize that this catalog were forged. We spent, me and my colleague from Mali, we spent a month looking for manuscript that in fact did not exist. So it was also an interesting experience. It seems like the Burkina Faso catalog was also the same, all produced by the same person, who was obviously a conman. So a conman behind a conman was also kind of an interesting experience. And I'm thinking about, yeah, I would say that these are kind of the different typologies of experience on the ground that I had looking for manuscripts. Yeah.
So in Tariq Al Fatash, it seems like Nobili here did a lot of looking into history and using a lot of history to legitimize Tariq Al Fatash. And I'm curious, how common do you think that forgery was during that time period? Because he was doing a lot of, he was inserting legitimate things, but some people didn't believe him. The scholars didn't believe him.
So I think there is two elements in your question. One is issue of contestation about specific types of claims. That is, I would say, is at the core of all of Islamic discourses are all about, the correct form of performing ritual, of understanding political rule, etc., etc. And also the major question of the legitimacy, who that is speaking authoritatively for Islam, in quotes and quote, is basically at the core of all the debates around different forms of, different aspects of Islamic history. But the issue of forgery and how common were forgeries, I think, is a very interesting one. And it seems like, for some reasons, the 19th century, and I'm kind of smiling, but in fact, it makes sense. 19th century is a time of substantial transformation in West Africa, social, economic, political. It's also the time when the Atlantic slave trade had been abolished. So these societies that have been reconverted since, for 300 years to mainly produce slaves for selling, started having a surplus of slaves that could not be sold anymore. So there is a lot of things changing on the ground, which also means that there was a lot of creative ways to make sense of this changing political, economic, and social environment. And Ali Jakite, so my colleague who's working with me right now, he has a nice chapter in his dissertation. He focuses on the Kunta, so one of those people who were complaining about the claims of Aḥmad Lobbo, who seem to be involved in forging up quite a lot of stuff. I think his chapter is called the Art of Forgery, 19th century and the Art of Forgery. So it doesn't seem like that Tariq Al Fatash was the only obvious forgery of the time. And there is a specific case that it's quite obvious, is that there is earlier texts that narrate the genealogy and the history of the early history of the Kunta, for example, that clearly ascribes local Berber ancestors to the Kunta, while in the 19th century, major works that summarize the history of the Kunta, is a very big book that has never been translated into English, and poorly edited actually in Arabic as well. There is, on the contrary, a claim of Arab ancestry for the Kunta for the first time. So there is a lot of things that get forged, made up in the 19th century.
Sort of going on this question of forgery in the 19th century is a period of transformation. I'm curious whether there's any impact of this 19th century version of Tariq Al Fatash upon the sort of conventions of, for example, you have this 19th century edition and then this propaganda back that you pointed out is propagated. Very quickly you have a scholar responding, no, I've gone and checked the citation. Right? Is there any specific relationship between the Aḥmad Lobbo's attempt to the relationship between, and as you mentioned, right, the act of forgery is very particularly ivory tower scholar or whatever. But there's his attempt at reconfiguring that political relationship and some impact upon the convention of scholarship with regards to forgery. That changed the stakes of what was happening and what the consequences are.
It's a fantastic question. And honestly, I don't think that there has been more attention to the problem of forgery. Although this kind of meticulous, I would say, philological antelitteram orientation of Muslim scholars is always very strong. I mean, if we think about the science of authentication of the hadith, it's been at the core, of Islamic scholarship since the very beginning of the history of Islam. So this attention to the reliability of transmitters has always been there. Although we must also say that the other side of the coin is that sometimes there are accepted genealogies that absolutely makes no sense. Make no sense because are obviously unlikely, but also because it goes back to one of the points we were having during class, so the conversation in class, is the belief, for example, that in order to have a chain of transmission of, for example, of a specific litany, a specific set of prayers, sometimes you might see a saint or you might see a prophet in a dream. So in fact, your chain of transmission that should cover 1,400 years is only 3 transmitters. It is not that people don't understand there, but that they believe that there is a possibility of an alternative way of transmitting, for example, this type of prayers. Yeah.
Are you able to show us the 2 texts side by side?
Oh no, because it's not on this computer. Yeah, but then no, I don't think I have it on the. No, I can't. But anyway, what Bruce was referring to is that the way in which I'm now editing and translating this text is by creating 2 columns, which I put the 2 different texts in 2 columns when the actual text diverge in 2 substantially different narratives. Then when they are actually shared, because there are substantial parts of the text that is shared, I only have 1 column. But it's quite impressive, but just, even if you don't read Arabic, but just scrolling down that file, you will see that for 10, 15, 20 pages, the Chronicle are actually different. And sometimes there is an extension. So it's empty on 1 column and it's very long on the other column because some parts were cut from 1 Chronicle and added to the other one. And the interesting thing is how the, Udas and De La Fosse, these 2 guys here, managed to deal with this. So they completely transformed the Chronicle to accommodate these variants. Instead of understanding that there was something wrong going on, let's say, oh, this manuscript forgot to add this. And sometimes if you change something from the 17th to the 19th century, it's because of a reason. Maybe the thing that is said in the 17th century is not really useful in the 19th century. So they have to make sense of things that are actually antithetical, one saying exactly the opposite of the other. So they manipulate the translation in ways that mahmoud is bizarre. And one passage that I really, really like is that Mahmud Kati, now we can reconstruct, if we remove the 19th century, we only focus on 17th century documents, we can reconstruct the biography of the alleged author Mahmud Kati quite in detail from different sources. And we know that he dies for sure in 1593, at least it seems like he died in 1593, for sure, we never say for sure with the Fatash, but he's supposed to be with Aske Muhammad the king when the prophecy is revealed, which happens in 1494. So there's some problem because even if he was living, if he had lived for 99 years, he was still 1 year old when the prophecy happened. So his life needs to be pushed back in time. But there is a section in the 17th century Chronicle in which it says during the rule of this particular guy in the 1520s, all of these people were born. And there is also the name of Mahmud Kati. So the author of the 19th century, careful in not creating a mess with the date, he changes this name. So in the 19th century, we see the name that is exactly the same name, but in a way the surname changes. It's not Mahmud bin al-Mutawakkil or whatever it is. I forgot all the component of his name. Ka'ati. We have the same name, but then the surname is changed into Sambo. And it's nice because the editor Udas and De La Fosse say here the copies of manuscript clearly makes a mistake. So we have Sambo in the manuscript, while in fact he means Kati. Missing, on the contrary, that this is one of the major things that took place at the time. So all of those contradictions that scholars have been pointing out are in fact not the contradiction of the 19th century Chronicle, but of the big mess that was produced by the French scholars. If you read the 19th century Fatasha, it's very coherent. There is no problems of people living for 150 years. No, that's well crafted. The problems come from the conflation of the 2 texts. Yeah, that's why it's very important now to separate the 2. Yeah.
Okay, well, if somebody has any other questions, I think we should thank Mauro for forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to people on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you.